Of all the changes that have occurred in this country since World War II, probably one of the most significant and far-reaching was the very slow but steady improvement in race relations. But it was not without violence. Some of those changes were accelerated by the dramatic events that transpired in the 1960s in three cities: Little Rock, Arkansas, and Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. I was on scene at all three, pushed around in Little Rock, intimidated in Selma, and tear-gassed in Montgomery. The Freedom Riders was a group of black and white citizens, most of whom came from northern cities to protest the entrenched segregation in all public places, including buses and movie houses. The Freedom Riders did not always ride. They marched on foot, traversing the highway from Selma to the capital city, Montgomery. There were three of us from NBC who were assigned to the story: reporters Herb Kaplow from our Washington bureau, Bill Ryan from the New York office, and me, the coordinator or field producer out of Chicago. The three of us met in Selma, and on our first evening there gathered in our hotel lobby and walked down the main street to find a restaurant. It was about 6:30 p.m. We went into the only restaurant that seemed to be open in Selma. As we entered the small cafe, we noticed that not too subtly, everyone was looking at us. We could hear chairs squeak as they turned to stare. It almost seemed they knew who we were and why we were there. Soon, three men from a nearby table walked over and stood above us. The first surly question was, "Who you folks with?" Before we could answer, a second man said, "You with NBC, the Negro Broadcasting Company?" As we sat in silence, the third man chimed in, "Or y'all with CBS, the Colored Broadcasting System?" The men were standing menacingly above us as another man added his 2 cents. "Maybe you're with ABC, the African Broadcasting Company." Nothing was spoken for a moment, and then one of us, I can't remember who, said we were with NBC. The men just glared and silently walked away. It was the first time in the South I realized we might be in some danger. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. The next day, we met up with our camera crew and caught up with the Freedom Marchers right outside of Selma. We got film of the marchers, young and old, men and women, black and white. The procession, as far as I can remember, numbered about 100 or 200 people. The Associated Press reported that by the time they got to Montgomery, there was a crowd of 25,000 marchers. Outside of a few catcalls and derogatory remarks or threats by passing motorists, there were no major disturbances. The Freedom Marchers were to attend, at the end of their journey, a special prayer meeting led by the then little-known preacher Martin Luther King. What was to happen in Montgomery was to shake a nation. The prayer meeting was set for early evening on Sunday at King's First Baptist Abyssinian Church. We were to cover the service and then to send the film by charter airplane to Atlanta for use on the Today Show Monday morning. Before the prayer meeting, some white segregationist protesters began to fill the large park in front of the church. Before the meeting got started, there were more than 800 white protesters in the square. Some had signs, but most of them wore angry scowls. They were chanting various segregationist lines. The favorite was 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. I'd never in my young life seen hatred displayed so openly and so vividly on the face of people. The mob was about 70% men. It didn't take a genius to realize there was potential for a full-scale riot. In anticipation of that possibility, there were almost 50 U.S. Marshals on hand to quell any rioting or a rush on the church. Inside, the prayer service had begun. Cameraman Bill Birch was filming that. It included a powerful sermon by Martin Luther King Jr. and the introduction of the Freedom Riders, who had marched from Selma to Montgomery. The cheers and applause for the handful of Freedom Riders were heard outside, where the angry white crowd had increased to at least 4,000 or 5,000 people. It immediately became apparent that the small squad of U.S. Marshals, armed only with nightsticks, would not be able to contain the crowds. Rocks were thrown that broke some of the church windows. What if the protesters rushed the church? Realizing the potential for disaster, I rushed into the church and went to a payphone in the basement to call the NBC News desk in New York and alert them of this pending riot. The crowd outside had swelled to more than 1,000 angry people. When I picked up the phone to call NBC in New York, I didn't get a dial tone. Someone was talking on the other extension. What I heard went something like this: "Bobby, you've got to get the National Guard out front right now. We've got a real potential for disaster. The U.S. Marshals can't handle it." I realized what I had heard and, like any good reporter, started to take notes immediately. It was a call from Martin Luther King Jr. to Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, explaining the situation and pleading with him to send in the National Guard to protect the people in the church from the racist mob out front. But before I could even get anything down on my notepad, a large black hand reached out from behind me, took the phone out of my hand, and said politely but firmly, "Son, that's a private call," and hung up the phone. By now, this was not only a big news story, it was momentous. The crowd outside had grown to over 5,000 people, jeering and shouting racial epithets. Within about 15 minutes, almost like the cavalry coming to the rescue, a dozen or more National Guard trucks rolled up. The troops, bayonets fixed, formed a line in front of the church. The crowd was getting ugly, chanting and brandishing clubs. Then the order was given. Tear gas grenades were hurled into the mob by the National Guardsmen, who were protected by gas masks. Unfortunately, the officer in charge of the troops made one critical mistake. He didn't check which way the wind was blowing. Some of the tear gas drifted back into the church through the windows that the mob had broken. Outside, our cameraman Earl Crotchet got it all on film. Inside the church, Bill Birch shot pictures of the black congregation and the Freedom Riders singing, "We Shall Overcome," at the same time coughing and crying from the tear gas. It was the most dramatic news film I'd ever seen. Birch won an award for the best news film of the year for his footage. As the tear gas spread throughout the park, the demonstrators ran in all directions, coughing and wheezing. It was almost dark by this time, so Earl got out a portable flood lamp powered by batteries. He handed it to me and said, "Let's go." We could hear gunshots being fired, but couldn't tell from where. So off we went, he with the camera, me with the portable light, running through the tear gas square without gas masks. We were both coughing and our eyes were tearing and stinging, but we got some powerful footage of the crowd. It wasn't until later that I thought to myself, what the hell were you doing, running after an angry mob with a spotlight? It was then about 9 o'clock at night. I knew we had all the film we needed. It was a day and a night to remember. It also ended up being one of the biggest news stories of the decade.